Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broodcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, any other agency of the U.S. government, or any other institutes with which our guests might be affiliated. So we're excited to welcome today the newest member of Team Krulak, Mr. Dan Rice, who has joined the Center and Marine Corps University as our dedicated subject matter expert on China and all things China related. He comes to us from the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, where he still retains affiliation, and in fact just recently published an article on the People's Liberation Army Air Force that we'll try and talk about a little bit here in our discussion. And we're also going to look back on some other recent developments that have occurred. There have been some sort of big political / diplomatic events over the last few weeks that have caught the news, and we'll go ahead and get his take on that. But first of all, Dan, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us for your inaugural episode here. And I think we'll just want to start with a little bit of background on, who you are, like where you went to study, what drove you to make China the focus of your work.
Sure. Well, first off, Major Brown, thank you for having me on the show. And thank you to all the audience members for joining us today. I know you have a great audience, so really excited to be able to speak with you today. A little bit about myself is I'm the China SME here, and I've studied China for right around 10 years. The whole rationale for why I decided to study China is actually kind of a nice, heartwarming story. My grandfather sent a clipping of a newspaper article in the mail. I received it. He said, "Hey, you should check out China. Get really focused on it." At the time, I was in business. I said, that kind of makes sense. So I started studying Chinese and found out I was pretty good at it. And then my real passion has always been national security.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did the Middlebury Summer Language Program. And at that program, there were a number of different government affiliates that were there that were expressing interest in folks that knew critical languages. And I discovered, wow, I can actually merge my new passion for Chinese because it's a very difficult thing and I like difficult challenges, but I could merge that with national security and actually help us understand the threat. Fast forward a little bit, I spent time in country doing entrepreneurial ventures. Got a lot of really good experience on the ground dealing with Chinese officials, both in government and business. And then I attended Nanjing University for language. I went back, attended the Hopkins Nanjing Center, which is, it's billed as the preeminent institution for studying Chinese language and culture.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a graduate program, mainly in Mandarin Chinese, where you spend a year there immersed in the culture and the language, and you learn various issues that China deals with, like national security, politics, ethnic minority issues, different social issues within China, and it gives you an unprecedented insight into actually how China functions. And that's a lot of good experience that I bring with me. And then I finished up my schooling at Johns Hopkins, getting their Master of Arts in Strategic Studies. So that was the capstone of my national security schooling. And then, obviously, as you mentioned, I work at the Mitchell Institute, where I got a great background and probably unprecedented education in aerospace power. Their General Deptula runs the show, and he was the principal planner for
Mm-hmm.
Desert Storm. So really great experience there. And now I'm really excited to join Marine Corps University and help our students with their professional military education and really understand China and bring all that experience that I got in country, studying the different issues, to the students so that they have a better understanding of the threat that they face.
Yeah, well, it's definitely it's good to have someone back in the China chair here. We were gapped for a little while, and we still had access to some smart people in the field, but definitely conscious that it's a focus area that needed somebody for the benefit of the student body and the faculty and staff here to plug into. So it's great we're able to plug that gap and get you in here. And for those in the audience, he's definitely been hitting the ground running, from supporting the schools in their classes to helping us do war game design. And in fact, you had a lot of input on one for a amphibious operation on Palawan, where thanks to your input, we got lots of missiles now.
Yes.
All the missiles are in there.
Yeah, that's one people a lot of times forget or don't even really know about, but the rocket force and how that plays into China's strategy. It is super critical. But yeah, I was glad to be able to help with that and bring that perspective and reinforce the messaging. Like, hey, look, it might not just be ships and planes. They have this entire force dedicated for this kind of task.
Yeah, and having played through that scenario a few times now, and in fact, we're going to tee it up here again for some midshipmen at the end of the week, but it's definitely been an eye-opener, because defending against those types of missiles is different from defending against, aircraft or cruise type missiles, due to the trajectories and the physics involved and all that stuff. But it was definitely eye-opening for the U.S. players to be like, wow, they have a lot, and there's not a whole lot I can do with them once they start sending them downrange. So, how do I keep them from sending them downrange in the first place?
Yep.
All right, so I'll shift over now to some of the current events that have been going on that you've been looking at, and those in our audience who may have different levels of awareness of what's been happening. But if we kind of rewind the calendar a few weeks, in China recently there was the 31st Party Congress. Is that right? 20th Party Congress. Oh, give them more credit for longevity than they deserve. So anyway, so that was Party Congress, getting all the senior leadership of the Chinese Communist Party together, and a few things were being watched for there. One was looking at President Xi Jinping and seeing it as an opportunity for him to really sort of cement his hold and his vision on the party, and by dint of that, China's future. But also, everyone's sort of looking at what language are they using, what things are they emphasizing. So if you maybe give us like a rundown of, what did you see? What were your big takeaways from that Party Congress?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't really want to get too far in the weeds of how it all operates, but the background on the Party Congress is it's a once every 5-year event, and it's where China brings together, they say they democratically elect, though how that works out, I'm not really sure, but they get a whole bunch of representatives from different localities together for voting on the top leadership of the party. So don't get it confused. This is a party Congress, right? Not a state Congress, but it does affect how the state actually operates. And so what happens is the roughly 2,000-ish representatives, they come together, they vote on the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the Politburo, and then the Standing Committee of the Politburo. So that's your top now 204 representatives of the CCP, and then your top 25 is the Politburo. Mm-hmm. So top 204 is Central Committee, top 25 is Politburo, and then top 7 is the Politburo Standing Committee. And it's actually a rank order event. So, number 1 is the top leader and goes on down through number 7. Those are really the critical players that you need to watch. So that was one of the things that a lot of folks were watching. Who stacks out into the top 7 of these of the CCP members. And what we saw in this last Party Congress was that, not too unsurprisingly, a lot of thought was consolidated under Xi Jinping. And so I'll go into a little bit of detail here, is that the Chinese Communist Party, before this last Party Congress, as a function of the changes that Deng Xiaoping back in the 70s and 80s made to the structure of the CCP, there were factions within the CCP. So what that translates into is that different factions had different ideology when it came to actually ruling China and what they would pursue. So there were certain factions that thought economic development were the way to go. There were certain factions that thought that more party control over direct policy was the way to go. And I'll give you one guess as to which one won out. But for those that are listening, it was the latter, right? So Xi Jinping, he's part of a faction called the Princelings. which is just a fancy way to say folks that are children of communist revolutionaries, back in the 40s, that were friends with Mao Zedong and led that effort. So he was part of the Princelings. The group that we saw that now seem not to really exist are part of what's called the Tuanpai, which are the Chinese Communist Youth League faction. So examples of that, in the 19th Party Congress, there were two folks specifically, Li Keqiang, who you might recognize that name. He was the second in the CCP. And then Wang Yang, who is another member of the Politburo Standing Committee. They both were, not kicked out, but they were not brought back into the Standing Committee. And those two represented more alignment under the Tuanpai, or the Chinese Communist Youth League faction. So now, with the new top 7, a lot of them, or all of them, really seem to be aligned with the Princeling faction and supporting of Xi Jinping. Now, why does that matter? It matters because before, where there could have been diversity of thought amongst the top leadership of the Communist Party, now it's very consolidated. And that leads itself towards more of almost a cult of personality under Xi Jinping, right? What Xi Jinping says is what happens. Whereas before, there could have been some dissenting opinion amongst the top leadership, which, actually works out in our favor, because as we know, as a government becomes more authoritarian, more consolidated, it leads to situations where one person's paranoia can cause significant changes in the policies that they take. Military buildup, and then they look internally, purges, right? Purges of the party, as we know Xi Jinping has done. So that could actually work in our favor. So some of the other things that came out of the Party Congress, most notably, is the change in the Central Military Commission. So the Central Military Commission, there's pretty much 3 top players there. There's Xi Jinping as the chairman, and then there's 2 vice chairmen. And that, for lack of a better term, is kind of equivalent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? The top dogs that run the military, and probably the Secretary of Defense looped in there. So the 2 folks that were promoted to the vice chairman, one is Zhang Youxia, and the other is He Weidong. They both appear to be folks that have actual military experience for general officers in China, which is very rare. If you think, China's really only been involved in one war in recent memory, and that was the Sino-Vietnam War. And actually, Zhang Youxia was a part of that. And then He Weidong, he was the Eastern Theater Commander, and he was in charge of running joint operations, joint exercises around Taiwan. So he brings a joint mindset to the table. And then Zhang Youxia was actually one of the guys that was heading up the acquisition, development, and research arm of the PLA. So he's really focused on military modernization. He also saw what happened during Desert Storm, and he realized, the Iraqi army looks a lot like the Chinese army at that point in time, and that they needed to modernize. So, with Xi Jinping, Zhang Youxia, and He Weidong, you've got Xi Jinping, who has his Xi Jinping thought. You've got Zhang Youxia focused on modernization, and He Weidong, who's focused on joint operations. So taking that one step further, we can expect in the future that the PLA is going to be really focused on what they have been in the past, which is modernization, trying to get to a true joint capability, and then bringing that to bear when it comes to their interest areas.
So I want to explore some of the sort of outputs of the Congress, but
Sure.
one thing I wanted to get your take on is there was, I don't know if it was at the very start or like the first couple days into, but there was a kind of remarkable sequence where one of the old leaders, or one of, I don't know if it was Hu Jintao. Okay, yes. I wasn't sure if I got that right, but he was removed, and it pretty much looked like he had not wasn't expecting this, so removed against his will from whatever that at the start of that session was going to be. And you had, Xi Jinping sort of sitting there. I don't know how to describe the look on his face, but he seemed totally okay with whatever was going on. So what do you think was, do we know sort of why that happened, or do you have a theory about what we were seeing there?
Yeah, so I've been asked this question a lot, and it's pure speculation to guess at exactly why Hu Jintao was removed, right? Because nobody's really going to know that answer unless you're him or his family, or one of the folks at the party congress. But I think the more important thing to take away from this is the messaging that came across. And so the background context here is that Hu Jintao was also part of that Tuanpai, right? And he was more or less the figurehead for the faction system within the CCP. So by removing him, and it actually happened later on in the week, but by removing him from the actual Congress, the messaging of that is, hey, the era of factions is over, right? From now on, it is Xi Jinping, and we, from the Chinese side, it would be, we need unification of party thought in order to pursue the goals that we have ahead of us. So that's my answer. I know, I'm sorry I didn't say like, oh yeah, medical emergency or, something else. But like I said, the messaging is the important part. And that is exactly what was it was probably intended to have that message.
Right. And it's the fact that the video of that was available, to the world afterwards seemed pretty clear that there was a definite message that Xi Jinping was trying to send.
Right.
Because if not, we never would have seen that.
Right.
Probably. Okay. So looking at now some of the outputs, the goals ahead for the Chinese Communist Party and the PRC as a whole, what were some of the big outputs of this party congress that you were notable to you?
I mean, I guess the most important thing is it's a lot of the same that we've seen from Xi Jinping, right? Things like doubling down on Taiwan, doubling down on zero COVID. Those were two really important things, but it's honestly a lot of the same. So this is kind of why I said there was no moment where it was like, oh my God, things are really shaken up in terms of the policy that they're putting out. It was more about getting rid of the faction system. That was the really remarkable thing. But I'll talk a little bit more about the Taiwan issue and the zero COVID issue specifically. Is that with Taiwan, clearly that is a friction point between the U.S. and China. It is the instance in which conflict between the two countries is most likely. And with Xi Jinping, he's really doubled, tripled, and quadrupled down on the fact that China needs to, using their term, reunify. Depending on who you ask, unification, reunification. They say reunify. I say unify. Yeah. But he's really focused on that. That goes to some of the critical party objectives that they've had for a long time, which is internal sovereignty, right? Reclaiming territory that they perceive as having been owned by China, or at least under direct control of China in the past. So that's a big issue. And I think maybe we'll touch on it a little bit later, but the same issue popped up again with Biden and Xi, I think it was yesterday. So that's still the same from the party. The zero COVID policy actually is probably the juiciest thing. It was very obvious that zero COVID was not really working the way that they thought it would, or at least, they say, yeah, we're getting rid of COVID altogether. There's no problems. And then they go into complete lockdown all over the country. And, it's hard to contain that kind of information. So by re-emphasizing the zero COVID policy at the party congress, that caused a lot of disdain amongst the populace. People are just fed up with having businesses shut down, not being able to travel, sometimes literally not being able to get food because they're locked in their apartment buildings. People have committed suicide over it. And re-emphasizing that, zero COVID has been so successful, and it's under the great leadership of the Chinese Communist Party that it's been so successful is, it's bad messaging. So that is one of the other takeaways. We've seen that actually very recently really kind of hit the fan, if you will, where Guangzhou right now has been witnessing a certain, I'd call it domestic turmoil. I wouldn't necessarily call it rioting, but where people are breaking down barriers. They're really sick and tired of having the zero COVID policy. The measures in place have not really been relaxed. There was recently a slight relaxation But knowing some folks that are on the ground there, it is a nightmare. They're going in and getting tested regularly, no matter what. And, it's not like a nice at-home COVID test where you just swab yourself and you put it in, use your app. You have to go to a facility that jam the swab down your nose, down your throat, and then you pretty much have to quarantine yourself. So those are two of the big things. The other more policy-oriented thing, because of the eradication of the faction system, what Xi Jinping is really looking for is consolidation of the economy under party rule. And that is a huge issue, one that is still shaking out because of the party Congress. But I know for a fact that some of the largest technology companies now have more or less forced joint ventures with state-owned enterprises. One of the big ones being Tencent, who are famous for their app WeChat, which maybe our audience has heard of before. It's the primary messaging app in China, and all Chinese diaspora pretty much use this app to communicate amongst themselves, their family, and on mainland China. It's the amount of information that WeChat has on an individual is astounding. It includes things like the equivalent of your social security number, all of your bank account information, all of your
it's not just a chat tool, right? It's got a lot of other things built in there.
So when I was an expat over there, if you didn't have WeChat, you could not function in society. It was your payment platform. It was your Kuaisan, like fast food, right? Order your dinner on the phone, get it delivered to you. You do that on your app. All of your shopping you do on your app. You'd buy train tickets, plane tickets, boat tickets, whatever tickets you need to travel on the app. So that's why, yes, the amount of information that company controls is crazy. It has every facet of your life on that app. So before there are special rules in place for these companies that are, technically private in order to have the CCP have insight into the data, right? Data rights. But now, very specifically, they're taking that one step further. And there's been some echoes of folks remarking that the way that Xi Jinping is approaching this looks very much like Mao Zedong era when he was controlling all the businesses in the centrally planned economy, which is a direct detraction from the ideology that Deng Xiaoping was going for, which is more like capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So a lot of a lot of central authority over the economy now, and that moving forward will probably only get worse. For us, that could have some severe implications, especially when we're looking at supply chains. Right? Where are we getting our things now? Well, before, you might make the argument that buying from this supplier in China might not necessarily support the PLA. And I know that was a huge issue recently with certain companies. But now, if most companies are controlled by the CCP directly through joint ventures with a state-owned enterprise and a quote-unquote private company, well, you better bet that those revenues are going to go towards military modernization. So that's going to be very tricky to navigate in the future.
Yeah, and so on the supply chain piece, if we have time, I might come back to this because from the U.S. supply chain towards China, there's been some recent changes, I think, in terms of like microchips, semiconductor technology, not reducing the import of those into China. But I want to cover down on your Mitchell Institute, another area of expertise here, because we talked about Taiwan as the main friction point, and you recently had a piece out on the Mitchell Institute, which we linked to on the registration here for those in the audience, and we'll put it again in the show notes for this. But you were talking about how everybody's sort of looking for what kind of indicators and warnings would we have if there was going to be a possible buildup to do an invasion of Taiwan, and you were focusing specifically on some key People's Liberation Army, Air Force, airfields. FLAF. Yeah. Every time I say that, like people like Army and then all the other things, I just kind of stumble. But Chinese Air Force airfields to watch, if as possible indicators and warnings. So what were you what were you looking at in that article? Where are those airfields, and what are you suggesting that we watch? as an indicator?
Yeah, absolutely. And, thanks for referencing that. So pretty much what I covered in the paper are 5 airfields on mainland China. To be fair, I did not cover more than that because of time requirements, right? Trying to get things out for the public to be aware of, but also length. I could have covered more airfields, but then it would turn into more of a book, which, I might actually consider expanding that research and going that route. But I covered the 5 airfields that were within the aircraft combat radius of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
So combat radius for our audience, right? If you don't know, it's the time to the distance from taking off to actually going to an area, a specific amount of loiter time over the area, and then back to your home airfield. So I covered 5 of these bases, and I used satellite imagery to analyze the bases. And one thing that really stuck out to me, at least, was that there were a large number of hardened, concealed, and buried aircraft shelter at these bases. It's actually funny because you look at them on a satellite image, and they have camouflage patterns all on the ramp space around these shelters, and there were no really good indications of what they would be used for, and not a lot of reporting on these shelters themselves, at least on the open source, right? And to be completely fair, I'm sure there's folks with security clearances that have seen these things, that know day one when the first brick was put in on them.
Yeah.
But for the unclassified realm, which is what I mainly deal with, there was not a lot on these. So I took that opportunity to explore it and dig into what these things were, right? Because you look at a picture of an airfield and you see a bunch of shelters and you're like, what the heck's going on here, right? You look at another airfield that's got the same thing, you're like, what the heck? And then you do a little bit of research online and there's nothing on it. You're like, wow, there's got to be something going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I dug into that, and as I was doing that, I ran across some different planes, right, that you could actually see at the airfields. A lot of them were older model Chinese airplanes, so primarily J6s. And, again, I was kind of like, well, this is really interesting, because I actually, a friend of mine, he's now at State Department, but he was tracking all the incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And when you look at the tables that he's come up with, and he pulls this information from the Ministry of Defense of Taiwan, there's not a lot of these J6s that are recorded. I mean, like a small handful of them. They're mainly newer aircraft that have crossed the ADIZ. And so I was thinking, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why do they have all of these older airframes on these bases that are the closest to Taiwan?
Yeah.
But they're not really using them for any of these ADIZ penetration exercises, right? Did a little bit more digging, and maybe our audience has heard of it, but there's some reporting on China converting legacy aircraft into unmanned combat aerial vehicles, or UCAVs. And so, I was kind of piecing this all together. There's hardened shelters here that are concealed. I'm seeing J6s at them. There's also a decent amount of reporting and some recording of these UCAVs being developed, but exactly where they're being placed, it's not very clear. Probably because it's a new phenomenon that we've really witnessed. I think maybe the first time that we saw these en masse was either earlier this year or late last year. So, putting it all together, I was like, hey, this could reasonably be an area where China would store a lot of these UCAVs, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them being their smaller airframes, and because they're UCAVs, they actually require less maintenance than an airframe with a pilot in it. If you think, you do a sortie with a pilot in, you bring it down, you have to run it through maintenance. And there's a whole lot of checks that you have to do to ensure the plane is safe to fly again. Whereas if you have the unmanned variant, it can actually just sit around. And, in what I have proposed is that these things might be going on a one-way trip. And if it is going on a one-way trip, well, you just really need to make sure that
just need to take off and go.
That's exactly right. So you don't have to have necessarily all of the security checks. that you would with a manned combat aircraft. So that's really what the paper covers. It covers the airfields, the hardened shelters, the numbers of hardened shelters. It explores one of the airfields that has actually been used for deployments of the Su-30 MKK, which is one of the more modern aircraft. It's not the most modern, but one of the more modern aircraft that the PLAF has operating out of this airfield, as well as its hardened, concealed, and buried shelters. And putting together a CONOPS that could envision China using these UCAVs out of these airfields that have been stored, and then following on with deployments of more modern aircraft for follow-on operations over Taiwan. So the whole point of it really is to highlight that the bases that we probably would need to suppress if anything were to kick off with between China and Taiwan are a little more robust than at least in the unclassified realm has been covered so far.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, right, implications for us are that we need to really make sure that munition stockpiles are adequate to actually be able to suppress an airfield. And you're a pilot, so you're aware there's multiple ways to suppress airfields. So pick your poison on how you do it, but either any way that you shake it, a hardened aircraft shelter is going to require quite a few munitions to actually affect. And some of those might have to be stand-in, right? As opposed to stand-off, because you'll need more standoff to get the same effect that you could achieve with certain stand-in weapons. So
yeah, no, and I think the munition thing, there's a couple things to watch there is, one, as we've been looking at the ongoing war in Ukraine, like munition expenditures has become a fairly important focal point. And I think it was either as a data point last week or the week before, the whoever produces the Javelin anti-tank missiles we used them all, and it's going to take a long time under the current production line to reconstitute that stock. Were they employed effectively, like against useful targets from a broader national security perspective for the U.S.? Sure, every Russian tank they blow up is one less that we might potentially have to deal with. But what if we need those missiles for something else? And how quickly do we reconstitute those? And then I think also that your assessment of different ways to go after the airfield, I think understanding exactly what they have there is a good piece of information to have, because if it's a UCAV vice an airfield that has piloted aircraft, which means the pilots have to be there, I could potentially see, like, if they're building fake barracks, right, or fake squadron areas, right, you could expend some of those exquisite munitions you don't have a lot of, because you don't understand what kind of an aircraft they have there, because UCAVs don't need pilots, and you just splurge, knock down a bunch of stuff that didn't matter because you thought pilots were there.
It gets really complicated, especially when you bring that into the equation. But yes, it means that you need to be more selective in what you target. You need to understand exactly what you're going against. And that was really the point of the paper. To be fair, there's certain areas, like I mentioned, there are definitely other airfields that we need to examine more closely than what has been done. I know the war zone, it's part of the Drive, which is an auto website, but they have their section called the war zone. They cover certain airfields pretty well. But the experience that I got in the education that I got at the Mitchell Institute actually has really been able to bring to light a lot of the more nuanced issues that we have to face when we're looking at these airfields. There's nothing better than having a pilot tell you, hey, look, this is what we would actually plan for. This is how we'd look at this issue set, and not just use some sort of pure satellite imagery speculation, but actually have folks that know how to get after a certain target set. And then the other thing with what should be a little bit more explored as well is, in the paper I do also offer that I got some really good reporting from a friend, Mike Dahm, former naval intelligence officer. He's over at MITRE now, but he went to the China Air Show, which actually was this last week, and he went there in 2018. He got a photo of how the PLA was thinking about converting their legacy aircraft into UCAVs. And, as I mentioned, J6s have been covered a lot. There's also J7s, J8s, and Q5s that they report that they're converting. And I spoke with somebody very recently who is an authority on the subject. And they were saying, hey, look, they could be developing these other legacy aircraft into UCAVs.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing with the J6s specifically is that they have so many of them available that the demand for converting other airframes might not really be there. They have something like 1,400 J6s hanging around waiting to retire when they bring on their new aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those, I think he mentioned at one point they were selling them for $10,000 an aircraft. And
It's a bargain.
Right. And people were buying them to joyride in, right? So, really, I think the bulk of the effort on the UCAV front could be with the J6s because there are proven variants that they've turned into supersonic cruise missile
Mm-hmm.
type things. They could also feasibly carry payloads if they had, if they envision on reusing them. But those are kind of the two areas that is definitely worth looking into further and probably having follow-on research on.
The UCAV employment, there are a few different options there that it's going to take some creativity to do because and understanding what they're transitioning those airframes into, like are they going to get thrown in there as bullet sponges just to soak up air defense against more capable missiles,
Right.
or do you turn them into maybe not like what we're calling in the Air Force like the trusted wingman, right? Like the completely loyal wingman, but still something that's got an extra munitions payload.
Right.
So like, do you ignore it either way? Like, oh, it's a J6, it's a bullet sponge. Well, it's a J6 that also has some sort of munition on it, and because you thought it was a decoy, it really wasn't. That's right. And because there's so many, that's a challenge.
Yeah, and then the other challenge itself is how do you operate these things in terms of there's been folks that have written on drone swarming. That is one way to do it, right? You could have a whole bunch of J6s, but then you get down to the technical details of how do you get all the aircraft in the air and then swarm them all together, right? That goes down to the people on the ground sending these planes off one at a time. And then do they have the technology to actually swarm these things together? Because you need a networked interface between the different aircraft in order to actually communicate and then position yourself.
Yeah.
They've done it with quadcopters, as we all saw at the Beijing Olympics twice now, right? Massive quadcopter swarms and cool little demonstrations we saw in Shanghai. But it's a whole different world going from a quadcopter to a fixed wing aircraft.
Yeah.
So, swarming, I don't know, but it does seem like at the very least, they do operate, I think it's 5 or 6 of these aircraft with 2 ground control stations, and they can at least send them on a predetermined flight path, right? So, translate that into, well, it's easy just to say, go from here to there, and that's it, right? Don't come back. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it depends on what you want the swarm to do.
Exactly.
And, even a potentially an unsophisticated swarm can still cause a challenge because you don't know, right? You on the receiving end, you don't know, and you may have to make some hard choices about whether you want to do something about it or not.
Yeah. And especially when it comes to Taiwan with their stockpiles of air defense systems, right? The number of missiles that they have is limited. Taiwan has in the past taken the stance of investing in larger platforms as a little bit of mirror imaging the U.S. So, buying aircraft to have on the ramp is a good political message to get across, saying we're investing in our military. We have platforms to show it. The problem is that each of those is very expensive, and it's quite honestly, if you look at the military balance on the cross-strait military balance, a lot of those aircraft will become overwhelmed. And then if you look at the way that they store their aircraft, a lot of these are ironically in hardened shelters. But as we know, you can collapse the front of a hardened shelter, especially if it's the side of a mountain. And then all of the aircraft in that shelter, you can't get access to, at least in the first few days. So that makes a lot of those platforms more difficult to get into the fight, right? And then you come to the question of, like you mentioned, this is a G6, it's an old aircraft. do I use my limited missile stockpile to actually shoot it out of the air? And if I do, does that mean that I have sufficient stockpiles to take on some of the other aircraft that are certainly going to be following on later? That is a complicated issue. And I think I don't want to speak for the U.S. government. I know that, I am independent thought here, but I know that we've at least tried to emphasize the importance of buying things like anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, anti-air missiles, etc., for Taiwan as a way to, ensure that if something happens, Taiwan can buy enough time to allow for support to actually reach them.
Yeah.
So, it seems like it's a feasible strategy. Whether or not Taiwan fully embraces that is completely up to Taiwan, right, and their policy makers. But
And
it's
it
a
also,
valid point there.
yeah, but it also goes into that just production of it. Even if they embrace it wholeheartedly, how quickly can we build them and send them over?
Right.
And then are we sending everything that gets built, or are we going to keep some for ourselves? Because again, we've been sending stuff to Ukraine for months now. Our own stockpiles have been depleted.
Yep.
And we're not at I think it's been a chronic issue identified in the defense industry, is like it is not currently positioned for like massed rapid production.
Yep.
Because that system is just, that demand has never been there. And so this system hasn't really been stressed,
Yeah.
So,
And it's like for the defense industrial base as well, that issue is not unique to missiles. It is not unique to aircraft. It is not unique to ships. It's across everything right now. So the challenge that we face is tremendous. And we need to really wake up to the fact that without investment in the industrial base, there will be nothing to support the effort. And I know that a lot of the folks in the industrial base are saying the same thing. And folks within the military, like yourself, are saying that, right? But it is time now that we make top-level policy decisions that support what we need to actually be able to secure our national interests. If we don't do that, we do risk facing a situation in which we don't have the ships or the aircraft or the munitions that we need to actually achieve the objectives that we have.
yeah, and you don't get that time back.
No, you don't, unfortunately.
All right, so I put out to the audience in the chat if they had any questions for you, and I've got a couple here. I'll throw this in there because it's a little outside of what we were initially, very military focused. This is kind of more your take on sort of cultural presentation in China. But
Okay.
From Nayla Mengel over at the National Museum of the Marine Corps, and questions about a show on HBO Max called Miss S. Are you familiar with it?
I am not. Have you seen it?
I have not. This is not my question. So
Yeah.
If you're not familiar, you may not be able to answer. So I don't.
Continue with the question. And Nayla, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Nayla, I will try to answer it as best as possible. I have not seen the show, unfortunately, but there are a lot of different cultural messaging or different things that we do see out of China.
Yeah. So she described the show, so I'll give the description and then we'll see what you do with it. So it's a detective series shot in China by HBO Asia with, Chinese actors. Script is written in Mandarin, and it depicts a wealthy detective in 1930s Shanghai. And the displays of her wealth, the character's wealth and that of her friends, are very prominent throughout the series.
Yeah.
And the show's been shown in China as well as the U.S., on HBO. Do you think that this is maybe an example of the Chinese government sort of leaning into a modern day, well-to-do Chinese middle class in Shanghai as both a past and present example of sort of an aspiration, that at one point they had this in the past, we should have this again, kind of thing?
That is a very interesting question, and thank you for that, Nayla. Based on the time period that the film or the series is shot, I would say no. And the reason that I say that is because you have to remember at that point in time, this is right around, after or during collapse of the Qing dynasty, the Communist Party is coming into power. and they were really concerned about the bourgeois and any display of personal wealth. So the time period is kind of weird there, because one would expect that in the 1930s, while there would be a wealthy class there, that they quickly found themselves kicked out of their homes with all of their property confiscated and sent to the countryside. It took 30-ish years from that point in time, but the messaging from the Communist Party was very much so that they were trying to get rid of that class. On the flip side, right? So that's a very academic way to analyze a TV show. On the flip side, if we're taking it for what it is, right, which is an entertaining show that shows, if it's a detective, not only that China is able to look internally and they have a lot of smart folks running the show, but that there's also a wealthy middle class. I mean, absolutely, that would support the CCP's messaging. If you weren't aware, China claims that I think it was last year, that they completely eradicated poverty.
Good for them.
Right. Yes. So we laugh, but it's a mean policy decision that was from the top down. That's like, we need to eradicate poverty by this point in time, 2021, and they came out and said, look, we achieved our objective. Under CCP leadership, we eradicated poverty. Now we have a middle class or a moderately well-off socialist society. So the messaging on that front of, yes, that there is a middle class, that they are able to have fancy things, right? They're able to afford a nice car or a nice watch, or that would definitely align with the idea of an ascendant China, which is definitely the messaging that the CCP wants to put out, and they've put out very aggressively. You guys might have heard of the 中国梦, the Chinese dream, right? Sounds very similar to the American dream.
Sure.
Intentionally there, but it was the same idea, right? The American dream: come to America and you can create your own wealth and you can make a life for yourself and pursue your passions. And they're trying to, I mean, it's not the exact same, don't get me wrong, but they're trying to use that messaging, kind of piggyback on the American dream and say, China, you can do something similar. You can come up from the poor and have a nice life and pursue what you'd like and have disposable income to go and purchase what you would like to have, right? Which, to be fair, in the past was not the case in China. And in the immediate past as well. The Cultural Revolution was not that long ago, 60s, 70s, right? And there's an entire generation that was alive during that period of time that is now, 60s, 70s, in that age. And they remember it very well. So when you have messaging coming out of the CCP that says that time's over and now we have a middle class and we are prospering and we're moving forward and your level of living is slowly growing, right? I'm thinking 生活水平, like thinking in Chinese right now, but your standard of living is increasing. Then that is proof from the CCP that they're doing something right for the population.
Sure.
So that could very well be the messaging they're trying to get across. But if it's not, if that's not on point for that show, certainly a lot of other shows that you'll see coming out of China, a lot of the videos they'll put out, a lot of the articles that they write will reflect that kind of messaging, for various reasons. But yes.
All right. Well, thanks for taking that question, and I think we got some pretty good insights out of it. Although none of us have seen the show, so maybe someone to watch once House of Dragon is over.
I might turn it on. Yeah.
So I got another question here, one from Albert Lee, and then I got one more for you, and I think we'll wrap it up because we're getting close to an hour here.
Sure.
So his question, this is kind of going back to Chinese international relations, and asking what your thoughts are on Beijing not doing much to sort of de-escalate tensions with India along the China-India border that have been going on the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Is this being stoked for a reason? Do you see them continuing to sort of keep that sort of on a low boil in the years to come?
Yeah. So That's a really interesting question. You said it's Albert Lee?
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you, Albert, for the question. So there's a lot that goes into the China-India relationship. And, again, it's speculation on exactly how it'll play out because everybody has their own individual vote. But one of the things that I've heard a lot about recently, and it goes back to the historical perception of where China had influence, is the I'm going to butcher the name, Arunachal Pradesh in India is a very hotly contested in the history books between China and India issue, right? Who controlled that Pradesh? So the border, the larger border that China shares with India, could be a reflection of the struggle for influence over that specific area. But more broadly, if you look at the geopolitics of the entire area, you've got Pakistan, which cannot be forgotten in this equation. You've got India and you've got China. And so obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but China and Pakistan are very, very much so aligned in not only their economic policy, but Pakistan is the focal point for the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mhm.
It's honestly about the only country that is so sold on it, and the institutions are built to support it. It's called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. That they're the launching point. And so if you look at the relationship between Pakistan and India, it is not necessarily a good one, right? Two nuclear armed powers that have in the past threatened each other.
Yeah.
In the past they had conflicts, still sometimes small skirmishes pop up, mainly between Islamists and Indian populations. But China exerting influence on India or trying to in whatever the way they are on the border, which there's a lot of funny things that happen there. But it could be to try to support Pakistan, and it also could be trying to influence the way that the Arunachal Pradesh, as well as other Southeast Asian countries, sway. So if you think of the entire peninsula, it's really India and China vying for influence there.
Uh-huh.
Myanmar is a really good example. Burma, right? Depending on who you ask. But it's a really good example of a situation in which China and India took different sides of the conflict there after the coup and the military junta that's in power. And because they've taken different sides, there's really no incentive for the international community to try to solve the issue because it will inevitably lead to winners and losers.
Yeah.
And that in itself has unfortunately frozen that conflict. For China's side, a lot of it is due to the geography and some of the projects that they have going throughout the peninsula. From the India side, it's obviously trying to maintain a more friendly government on the area, as well as also other regional issues. One of the big ones is any sort of destabilizing conflict in that area generally leads to a large population entering India.
Yeah.
Which for them causes a lot of bureaucratic but also systemic issues. So I don't know if I answered your question the way that you might have wanted, but it is a very, very complicated issue. And the border spats that you see along the larger border, things like China building reinforced roads, or my favorite one, slowly over the years pushing the signposts further and further out. It's just ridiculous. But that is a reflection of the larger geopolitical landscape that the two face within the larger region. And it comes to blows at times. Often it's unarmed, but there has been a significant escalation in the military buildup and testing of different aircraft because the elevation is different.
Yeah.
So, I'm speaking from the aircraft side because of my background with the Mitchell Institute, but I have seen them running things like Males and Hales, medium altitude, is it
Long endurance.
Long endurance, right? And high altitude, long endurance UAVs for surveillance over there. You look at some of the airfields over there, it's primarily for surveillance, but I think it's and India's doing the same thing, by the way. It's not a one-sided equation. They've been building tunnels for better access. They've been reinforcing positions, but both of the countries right now seem to be in the observe and report mode, as opposed to like actually kicking off conflict. And the final thing I would offer on that is that if you look at the different theater commands that China has broken out, the Western and Southern Theater Command are both in charge of that border, and there's specific reasons why they why the CCP in China places a strong emphasis on sovereignty and border security, specifically in that area. But it all ties back to that historical perception of who controlled what, and that border, from the Chinese side, has always been contested into exactly what pieces of land who controls. So hope that answers the question, Albert.
Yeah, no, that was it's an issue that, with other things going around the world has, probably sort of gone onto some people's back burners, but it has not gone away.
No,
and the potential for something really bad happening, is there. So it's good.
Yes.
It's good to remember that. So I got one more question for you, and then we'll wrap things up here. And this is more sort of your take on, of all the different, security issues, looking at China and the U.S., China and the rest of the world. What is something that you've been watching that you think maybe deserves more attention than it's been getting?
Yeah. So this is kind of a weird one. I think the thing that deserves more attention is, please don't paint me as like kumbaya guy, but I think there's actual genuine opportunity for not necessarily reconciliation, but cooperation between the two countries. And a lot of times, if you have insights into both worlds, you can see that there's this echo chamber in both countries that are pushing towards conflict. And it's dangerous. And a lot of it comes from misunderstandings. I mean, obviously, in a multipolar world, people are going to fight for influence. They're going to try to secure their resources. But in that competition, and actually this goes to the Biden-Xi meeting, something that they were talking about, right? They can compete without having conflict.
Yeah.
Ideally, right? That would be a perfect world. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. But I think trying to create more opportunities for communication and understanding would help us at least try and avoid conflict where it otherwise might kick off. Because as we've seen in history, one of the most common ways that conflict does occur is when misunderstandings happen. Some small event leads to a larger misunderstanding. People take actions. And when you're dealing with large machines like the US military or the PLA, once you start an action, it is very, very hard to step back from that edge. Right? So I think there is better opportunity, and there needs to be mechanisms in place to ensure that any of this better understanding doesn't lead to propaganda narratives, right? Because that's what we've found in the past is a huge issue. Things like the Confucius Institutes, which should have been a center for learning about China in the US, turns into an apparatus that is used to monitor Chinese populations in the US. Like, that can't be the way that we pursue it, but there needs to be better venues or more venues to try to have communication to deconflict where we are going. Otherwise, I personally am afraid that things like the exercises over Taiwan that happened after Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited could lead to real conflict, and that's something that nobody wants, not China nor the US. So that's my take on it. That's what I hope we can look into more. And I'll try to bring that, some perspective so that we don't see everything as, or we don't see China as a 10-foot tall giant in every area and every venue, right? I'm trying to bring that understanding at least to students at Marine Corps University so that when they see events that occur, they can put on an analyst hat and say, that is something we need to be concerned about and needs to be addressed. Or that is not something that necessarily warrants, top level policy decision or military action to solve, right? Because if you can suss those two out, I have a feeling that it's possible to compete without necessarily going to.
Ideally, right?
Ideally,
Because like you said,
it's all ideal.
nobody wants that, and no one's going to win in sort of a sense that
Right.
like the world that comes after more than the one that comes before. So
Right.
we'll look to you then for those, somewhere between 1 foot and 10 foot tall, those analyses here in future episodes.
5 feet
yeah,
tall.
5 foot 5 feet tall, right? And just to make sure that we're taking everything, that it's grounded in reality, and that
Right.
we're not just taking certain things at face value or inflating them.
Yeah, the worst thing that could possibly happen would be like another Red Scare, right? And then everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, everything's bad. We have to go to conflict." That would be the worst case scenario from both sides, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't get it twisted. It's not just the U.S. side; it's both sides. So yeah.
All right. Well, hey, great. We're past an hour here, so we're going to wrap it up. I think it's a great kickoff episode for our new China SME here, Dan Rice. Thank you for your time and for your questions and insights. And to the Team Krulak audience that's out there, obviously we're going to get Dan on again because, we've got our paws on him now, so it's easier for us to go find him. But we're already thinking of some opportunities to have him discussing some more multipolar interactions from our different experts here at the Krulak Center and Marine Corps University. So, things in the pipeline are we're looking at I think a Russia, Iran, and China look at the thing nobody really wants to talk about, but it's out there, which is, nuclear weapons, employment, doctrine, things like that, because all of those countries have different pieces. And as it happens, we have subject matter experts in all those countries here at the Krulak Center, which is fortuitous. So that'll be something that's coming down the pipeline. And then, of course, as things pop up and develop, we're always happy to do, kind of ad hoc impromptu episodes, kind of like the down the rabbit hole to, focus on things that are happening in real time. Because again, now that we have, Middle East, Russia, and China all sitting here, those things are never idle. So it's good to be able to talk about things as they develop in real time to provide those, insights when they're useful. So thank you again, Dan. Thanks to the audience for joining us for this episode. Our next broadcast is already right around the corner. This Thursday, we'll be joined by Elena Wicker to talk about something a little bit different. She's going to talk to us about work she's done in applying machine learning and language analysis to U.S. national strategy documents. Registration information for that will be out soon, so make sure you're checking your email or following us on social media for details. And also, as always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey that we've started to include in the show notes the last couple months to help us do better. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It really does help us reach a wider audience. And thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you, Major Brown. Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.